leaking toxic barrels at 1,600 feet, preserved mob murder victims found by ROVs, an FBI/sheriff cover-up, and fabricated quotes attributed to real people. Colin West of Clean Up the Lake, UC Davis Turk's director, Washoe County Sheriff's Office. None of that happened. I checked, and the real story is different but still genuinely eerie. Real, the reference script you send, invents things that aren't real. A field of hundreds of drought and clarity problems, a real underwater maritime trail, and a real non-profit finding decades of sunken cars and trash. No barrels, no bodies. Since Wasim's projects need authentic sourcing, I've written a fully original script built on the true material rather than the invented one. You can now walk the shoreline of Lake Tahoe and see things that, for most of the last century, no visitor was ever meant to notice. Rusted tires, half buried in sand. The corner of a bumper poking through the shallows. A rowboat's ribs silvered and soft, resting where a resort dock used to be. None of this is new. It has been down there the whole time. What is new is that the lake itself has started giving it back, and once you understand why, you will never look at that impossible blue water the same way again. Lake Tahoe sits at more than 6,000 feet of elevation, straddling the border between California and Nevada, cupped inside a basin carved by geological faulting millions of years ago. It is the largest alpine lake in North America and one of the deepest lakes in the country, plunging more than 1,600 feet at its deepest point. The water is famous for its clarity, water so transparent that for decades visitors could watch a coin sink 30, 40, even 70 feet before it vanished from sight. That clarity is not an accident of beauty. It is a symptom of biological emptiness. The granite basin that holds Tahoe contributes almost no nutrients to the water. Very little grows in it, very little decays in it, and very little disturbs it. Cold water near the bottom rarely warms above the low 40s, even in summer, and at extreme depth the lake barely mixes with the surface at all. Whatever settles into that stillness tends to stay exactly where it lands, undisturbed, sometimes for 100 years. That single fact, more than any legend or headline, is what makes Tahoe such an unusual body of water. It behaves less like a lake you swim in on a summer afternoon and more like a sealed container. And for most of the 20th century, people quietly treated it that way. To understand what is now surfacing at Tahoe, you have to go back to the years right after World War II, when this remote alpine basin transformed almost overnight. Before the war, Tahoe was difficult to reach. The roads were rough, often closed by snow for months at a stretch, and only a handful of lodges served the wealthy tourists who bothered to make the trip. The war changed the calculus. Training facilities went up nearby, roads were improved to move personnel and equipment, and soldiers stationed in the region got their first real look at the lake. When they came home with money in their pockets and a car in the driveway, many of them remembered it. The boom that followed hit fast. Casinos opened on the Nevada side of a state line, where gambling was legal, drawing crowds who wanted more than just scenery. Hotels and resorts multiplied along both shores. Modest summer cabins turned into year-round homes as more families decided to stay. Emerald Bay, one of the most photographed coves in the entire Sierra Nevada, had its own resort humming with paying guests through the 1920s and into the following decades, complete with hotel cabins and a small fleet of launches and rowboats ferrying visitors across the water. Growth on that scale generates waste, and in the middle of the 20th century, the country simply had not yet built the regulatory machinery to handle it responsibly. Environmental law, as we understand it today, barely existed. There was no coordinated system for hazardous waste disposal, no basin-wide monitoring, no real concept that a lake this size could be harmed by what got thrown into it. And Tahoe was right there, enormous, deep, and to anyone standing on the shore, apparently bottomless. Boats that had outlived their usefulness were deliberately sunk rather than hauled out and scrapped. Docks and small craft that resorts no longer needed were scuttled at their moorings. It was cheaper, and at the time it did not look like it was hurting anything, because the surface stayed clear and the tourists kept coming. For decades, that was where the story stopped. The lake looked pristine. The boats and debris that had gone under were assumed to be gone, or at least irrelevant, sitting in some dark, cold, unreachable place nobody needed to think about. Then, slowly, technology and persistence started to change what people could actually see. In 2018, California State Parks and the Sierra State Parks Foundation opened something that had never existed before anywhere in the state. An official underwater trail for scuba and snorkel divers, mapped out along the floor of Emerald Bay. It is called the Emerald Bay Maritime Heritage Trail, and invites the public to do something that would have sounded absurd a generation earlier, to swim down and look, on purpose, at exactly the kind of sunken history that used to stay hidden. The trail includes 4 documented sites. Just offshore from what is now a boat-in campground lies a scattered collection of small vessels, sunk at their moorings, sitting between 30 and 60 feet below the surface. Divers can find a metal kayak, a day sailor, a launch, wooden fishing boats and rowboats, some of them more than 100 years old, kept remarkably intact by the same cold, low-nutrient water that makes the lake so clear in the first place. The centerpiece of the trail is the barge dive site, first documented by park archaeologists back in 1998, long before the wider trail opened to the public. 2 enormous wooden barges rest there, built from massive ponderosa pine timbers, sitting between 10 and 40 feet deep. These were not pleasure boats. Lumber companies once used them to haul cordwood down the lake for part of the year, then repurposed them as car ferries during the summer months, floating automobiles across the water for tourists who wanted to reach the far shore without driving the long way around. Since the barges had no engines of their own, they had to be towed or pushed by steamers. The larger of the 2 barges stretches over 100 feet long, and it remains, by the official account of California State Parks, the largest and most diverse known collection of historic small watercraft, still resting in its original underwater location anywhere in the country. Then there is the Florence M., a wooden passenger launch built in a Stockton boatyard back in 1915, later purchased by the proprietor of the Emerald Bay Resort and brought up to the lake in 1926 to carry day trippers out onto the water. It likely represents the oldest boat in the entire collection. Somewhere nearby rest a wooden fishing boat and a hard-chine skiff, the last physical remnants of a resort that closed decades ago when the state acquired the land in the 1950s and tore the buildings down to build a campground in their place. None of this was hidden out of shame. It was simply forgotten. The ordinary residue of a resort community that operated, wore out its equipment, and moved on, the way small tourist economies always have. What makes it remarkable is not what it conceals. It is how well it survived. The same cold, sterile, nearly lifeless water that keeps Tahoe famous for its clarity also acts as an accidental museum, holding wood and metal in something close to suspended animation for the better part of a century. But the trail at Emerald Bay is the sanctioned, celebrated version of what lies under Tahoe. There is a much larger, much messier version that nobody organized on purpose, and it took a very different kind of effort to bring it to light. In 2019, a Tahoe local named Colin West set out to do something that had never been attempted anywhere on the lake before. He wanted to clean the entire underwater shoreline, all 72 miles of it, using scuba divers, free divers, kayakers, and boaters working together in a systematic sweep. People close to the project told him he was out of his mind. Nobody had ever tried to survey and clear an alpine lake of this size before, certainly not one this cold, this deep, or this exposed to sudden weather. West and his team ran a pilot cleanup along 6 miles of shoreline first, just to see if the idea was even feasible. It worked well enough that a regional nonprofit focused on funding environmental projects around the lake agreed to help finance the rest. The full effort finally got underway in 2021, delayed for a year by the pandemic, and it did not go smoothly. Divers worked in freezing water through difficult weather, evacuated partway through because of the Caldor fire, and pushed on through heavy snowstorms when conditions allowed. By the time the 72-mile circuit was finished in 2022, the team had pulled more than 25,000 pounds of material out of the lake. Old cans, fishing gear, tangled plastic, tires, a discarded statue, a barbecue grill somebody apparently decided was easier to sink than haul to the dump, an engagement ring lost or thrown. Nobody will ever know which. And in one case that Colin West has talked about publicly without naming the exact location, something considerably darker, a weapon, sealed inside a black garbage bag and tossed off a cliff into the water, discovered during a routine sweep and handed directly to a county sheriff's office, which indicated there may have been other evidence bagged alongside it. It is a small, unsettling reminder that not everything dumped into a lake this size is innocent litter, even if the overwhelming majority of it is exactly that. That first 72-mile pass was only supposed to be the beginning. Over the following years, West's organization, now operating as a nonprofit called Clean Up the Lake, kept diving, kept mapping, and kept noticing that the deeper zones just beyond their original reach told an even messier story. They spent roughly 4 years running research dives, including 60 separate deep dive surveys and 2 years of monitoring to test how effective their cleanup methods actually were at greater depth. What they found convinced them the job was far from finished. Zones between 35 and 55 feet turned out to be significantly dirtier than anything they had already cleared, thick with decades of accumulated litter and degrading plastic that the original shallow sweep had never touched. So Clean Up the Lake launched a second phase, an expanded deep clean project extending their reach an additional 30 feet beyond the first effort, sending divers to work the entire 72-mile circumference again, this time between 35 and 55 feet down, using diver propulsion vehicles and enriched air gear to extend their working time in water that never really warms up. Officials with the organization estimated the new phase alone could recover close to another 30,000 pounds of debris. Meanwhile, the lake was quietly delivering its own kind of